Hey everyone, and welcome back. Today we're really diving deep into the world of wireless communication channel correction. We've got a ton of research here, really fascinating stuff, all about how your data actually makes it to you
Yeah,
reliably, even when the wireless channel, well, it's not always a smooth ride.
it really isn't.
Yeah.
Yeah, imagine a signal trying to navigate a maze, but blindfolded with only these faint echoes and whispers to guide it. That's the kind of interference we're talking about, and yet somehow we've figured out ways to make sure that data gets through without a scratch. That's what we'll be unpacking today.
Exactly. And, as third-year computer science students, I'm sure you're all familiar with the challenges of wireless channels. Errors are a fact of life. But we're not just skimming the surface today, no way. We're going deep, deep into the world of forward error correction, FEC as it's called, to see how it's completely changed the game for data transmission.
It's true, the name says it all. Forward error correction. We're not just sending data anymore, we're sending data that can actually fix itself. Imagine that, embedding self-correction instructions right there in the data itself. That's the beauty of FEC.
Absolutely. It's like sending a message that can heal itself. So let's start with a classic example of FEC in action, something you've probably come across before, Hamming codes. Now, don't worry, we're not just doing a basic recap here. We're going to really break down the mechanics, even get into some more complex scenarios. Our source material uses a simple example, a 4-bit data sequence. It's 1011. To make this self-correcting, we'll use what's called a 7-4 Hamming code, meaning we add 3 extra bits, we call these parity bits, to our original 4. Think of these parity bits like, I don't know, error detectives.
Yeah, good analogy. And these detectives are positioned very strategically, you see. Each parity bit is assigned to check for errors in a specific section of the entire sequence. They're like guardians, making sure everything stays in order.
Okay, I like that, guardians of data integrity. So let's actually visualize this, all right? If we take our data bits and put them into this 7-bit format, we get P1, P2, then a 1, P3, a 0, 1, 1, the PS, of course, being those parity bits we need to calculate. Now, here's where things get interesting. Each parity bit's value, it depends on specific data bits. It's not random. For example, our parity bit P1, it checks positions 1, 3, 5, and 7. It has to make sure the total number of ones in those positions, including itself, is even, always even.
Exactly. Balance is key. So for P1, we've got data bits in positions 3, 5, and 7, which are 1, 0, and 1. That's 2 ones, already an even number. So to maintain that even count, P1 needs to be a 0.
Perfect. And we follow that same logic for P2 and P3 as well. P2, which checks positions 2, 3, 6, and 7, needs to be a 1. And P3, checking 4, 5, 6, and 7, that should be a 0. And there we have it, our complete 7-bit code word ready to go, 0110001. But now the real test, what happens when an error sneaks in?
Right. Let's say during transmission, that fourth bit just decides to switch sides from a 0 to a 1. Happens all the time. Interference loves to mess things up.
A digital paper jam, you could say. So how does our self-healing message kick in? How does it even know something went wrong?
So on the receiving end, when this slightly altered message arrives, that 01110 blend, the receiver, it recalculates those parity bits based on what it got. If they line up perfectly with the received parity bits, great. But if they don't, well, then it's game on. That mismatch, we call it a syndrome. That's our clue. That's how we know something's off.
Like a detective finding a stray fingerprint at a crime scene. Each syndrome points to a specific JIT that's gone rogue. In this case, our mismatched parity bit, it leads us straight to that flipped 4th bit.
And knowing that, the receiver can just flip it right back to its original state, restoring the data. It's elegant, isn't it?
It really is. But, and this is important, Hamming codes, they're great for these single-bit errors. But what happens when we have multiple errors, a whole pileup? Can Hamming codes handle that kind of chaos? Or do we need something even stronger?
That's where cyclic redundancy check, CRC for short, comes in. And trust me, understanding this, it'll give you a whole new appreciation for how we even have reliable data transmission in the first place.
CRC, all right, it's your time to shine. How do you deal with those more complex error situations?
Well, CRC, it takes a slightly more mathematical approach. Uses something called polynomial division to create a special checksum. We won't get too deep into the math here, but imagine just for a second that you're treating your entire data sequence like a polynomial, and then you divide it by another pre-agreed upon polynomial.
Polynomial division. Okay, now that's next level error correction. I like it.
And the remainder we get from that division, that becomes what we call the frame check sequence, or FCS, which gets attached to our data. Now, when the receiver gets this package, it does the same division. If the remainder they get matches the FCS that was sent, then we're good. If it doesn't, red flag, something went wrong, could be a burst error where multiple bits are corrupted.
A superpowered checksum. That's what it sounds like. No wonder it's used everywhere. Ethernet, so many other protocols. The unsung hero of data transfer.
Absolutely. CRC, it's fantastic for catching a much wider range of errors than Hamming codes, especially those burst errors. Those are tricky. But it's not the only tool we have. Not at all.
There's more. This is getting good. It sounds like we need a whole arsenal of techniques just to deal with the wild world of wireless interference.
You said it. Yeah, we've talked about making the data self-correcting, but what about, when the signal itself gets distorted along the way? Like, imagine you're on a call and suddenly the person on the other end, their voice sounds all warped like it's coming through a bad speaker. That's kind of what multipath fading is like.
Oh, multipath fading. The worst. The ultimate enemy of clear communication. So how do we even begin to tackle that? Can we, unwarp the signal?
We can, actually. That's where adaptive equalization comes in. It's pretty amazing. Imagine a filter, but this filter is smart. It's constantly analyzing the incoming signal, figuring out how the channel is messing it up, and then it applies the exact opposite effect to cancel it out. That's adaptive equalization in a nutshell.
That sounds like something out of a sci-fi movie, like having a sound engineer cleaning up a live recording, but in real time.
Yeah.
How does that even work, technically speaking?
Well, it's all about counteracting that distortion that those multiple paths create. Because remember, in a wireless environment, the signal, it's not traveling in a straight line. It bounces off everything, creating all these echoes that hit the receiver at slightly different times. Adaptive equalization, it identifies those echoes and basically neutralizes them so the original signal can come through.
So it's like having a microscopic cleanup crew putting all those scattered signal fragments back together. That's wild. But even with all that, what about those times when the signal just completely disappears? Like in an elevator or driving through a tunnel and your connection just drops?
Right, those frustrating dead zones. That's where we bring in diversity techniques. It's all about having backup plans, multiple paths for your data to reach its destination no matter what.
Multiple paths to success. I like it.
Yeah.
So what kind of options are we talking about here with these diversity techniques?
Well, we've got three main types: space diversity, frequency diversity, and time diversity. Each one has a different way of making our signal more resilient. Let's start with space diversity. Imagine you have multiple antennas spaced out from each other. Because of those different paths we talked about, each antenna is going to receive a slightly different version of the signal. And with space diversity, we can actually combine those signals in a smart way to reduce those fading effects.
So it's like having multiple witnesses to an event. Each one sees it from a different angle, giving you a more complete picture. What about frequency diversity?
With frequency diversity, it's like sending your data on multiple radio stations at the same time. We take the same signal and transmit it over different frequencies. And since each frequency experience is fading independently, the chances of them all fading out at the exact same time, pretty slim.
Hedging our bets across the entire frequency spectrum, I see. Okay, and what about time diversity? How does that work?
Time diversity, it's all about spreading out the signal over time. We can interleave our data with other data, or even introduce intentional delays to create that separation. That way, even if a whole burst of the signal gets lost, the receiver can still piece together the original message from what does get through.
So we've got space, frequency, and time diversity, each one with its own strategy to fight against signal loss. But I've also heard of something called MIMO, which I think stands for multiple input, multiple output. How does MIMO fit into all of this?
MIMO, that's like the all-star team of diversity techniques, especially when it comes to space diversity. Instead of just one antenna, we're talking multiple antennas, both at the transmitter and the receiver. And this lets us create multiple parallel data streams, essentially multiplying the capacity of the channel.
Hold on, multiple parallel data streams, so it's like having multiple lanes on a highway, so we can transmit more data at once?
Precisely. MIMO is a big reason why our 4G and 5G networks are so fast. It's all about those parallel streams. And we're not stopping there. The future is even more antennas, something called massive MIMO, which is going to push those data rates even higher.
Massive MIMO, wow. But all of this, it kind of relies on the channel conditions staying relatively stable, right? What if the signal strength is fluctuating wildly, like, I don't know, a roller coaster? How can we keep up with that level of unpredictability?
Well, that's where adaptive modulation encoding comes in, or AMC for short. It's like, imagine if your signal could actually sense how the channel was doing, and adjust on the fly, like a chameleon changing its camouflage. That's basically what AMC does.
A signal that can, read the wireless room?
Yeah.
That's wild.
Yeah.
Okay, tell me more. How does it actually work?
So AMC is always monitoring the channel, constantly checking things like signal strength, how much noise there is, interference, everything. And based on that, it can actually change the modulation and coding schemes it uses in real time.
So it's like choosing the right gear for the driving conditions, right?
Yeah.
Clear road, you can speed up, but if it's, bumpy and crowded, got to take it slow.
Exactly. When the channel is in good shape, AMC can use these higher order modulation schemes, which means we can pack more data into each transmission, get those speeds up. But when the channel gets messy, noisy, signals weak, then AMC switches to these more robust schemes, lower rate, but much more reliable. Prioritize getting the data through.
Always adapting, always strategizing. This LMC sounds like the ultimate wireless chess player. But even with all these amazing techniques we've talked about, all squeezing every last drop of performance out of our connections, is there a limit? Can we just keep going faster, or do we eventually, hit a wall?
That is the million-dollar question. And it brings us to our final frontier, which is bandwidth expansion. It's like this, you could have the fastest car in the world, but if you're stuck in a one-lane traffic jam, it doesn't really matter, does it? Bandwidth, that's like the width of the highway for our data.
Okay, so how do we go about widening that data highway then?
One way is something called carrier aggregation. Imagine taking multiple lanes on a highway and just merging them into one super lane. That's kind of what carrier aggregation does. We combine multiple channels together to create a wider bandwidth and, boom, much higher data rates.
A data superhighway. I like the sound of that. What else have we got?
Another really powerful technique is frequency reuse. What we do is divide a geographic area into these smaller cells, and each cell can use the same set of frequencies as long as they're spaced out enough to avoid interfering with each other.
Like having multiple conversations in the same room, but each one in a different table so they don't overlap. Smart. But I have a feeling you've saved the most futuristic, bandwidth expanding trick for last, right? What about this millimeter wave technology? Where does that fit into all of this?
You're right. Millimeter wave or BNM wave, that's a game changer. We're talking about operating at much, much higher frequencies, which opens up a whole new world of bandwidth possibilities. It's like discovering a secret network of super fast data lanes that were always there.
Higher frequencies, more bandwidth. It does sound almost too good to be true. But there's always a trade-off, isn't there? What's the catch with these higher frequencies?
You know it. Wave has amazing potential for speed. We're talking crazy fast data, but it does come with challenges. Signals at these frequencies, they tend to have a shorter range, and they're easily absorbed by obstacles, walls, trees, things like that. It's like having a super fast sports car, but it's not so good off-road.
A trade-off indeed, but one worth exploring, especially for those applications where speed is everything. Well, that brings us to the end of our deep dive into the incredible world of wireless communication channel correction. We've covered a lot of ground today, from self-healing data packets, thanks to forward error correction, to the adaptive intelligence of AMC, the mind-blowing possibilities of millwave, and everything in between.
And even with all that, we've really only just scratched the surface. The future of wireless communication, well, it's brimming with potential. Our demand for data is only going to keep growing, and you can bet that brilliant minds will be working tirelessly to make sure our wireless connections can keep up.
It's an exciting time to be a computer scientist, that's for sure. I hope you all enjoyed this deep dive as much as we did, and maybe even came away with a newfound appreciation for the magic that makes our wireless world possible. Until next time, keep these connections strong, and thanks for joining us on the deep dive.